On the quiet, snowy roads of Breckenridge, Colorado, something unusual happened that morning. Something that would change 3 lives forever. A police officer, a lost child, and a young German Shepherd puppy, fluffy and bright-eyed, with courage far beyond his size. No one saw it coming. No one believed a pup that young could know what to do. But sometimes, heroes come in small paws, and they don't bark for help. They stand in your way and won't let you pass. Before we begin, tell us where in the world are you listening from? Your comment helps our stories reach more hearts. The morning air in Breckenridge, Colorado, bit through every layer like a knife dipped in ice. Snow blanketed the pine-lined roads in heavy silence, muting the world into a dull hush. It was just after 6 a.m., and the winter sun had barely begun to smear light across the mountaintops. Officer Laura Whitman gripped the steering wheel of her cruiser, watching her breath cloud up in the cabin. She had been on the force for 15 years, and the early morning patrols were usually the quietest empty roads, occasional elk sightings, and time to think. That day, she didn't know she was driving straight toward a moment that would change her life. Laura was in her early 40s, tall with broad shoulders and a naturally athletic build. Her auburn hair was tied tightly in a bun under her uniform hat, and there were soft lines beneath her eyes, not from age, but from sleepless nights and quiet grief. 4 years ago, she had lost her only son, Tyler, to a drunk driver. Since then, she buried herself in work, avoiding holidays and family gatherings, pretending that structure and duty could fill the silence in her chest. She was known around the department as steady, logical, and emotionally distant, but not unkind. The tires of her patrol car crunched over a fresh layer of snow as she turned a narrow bend near Hollow Creek Trail. That's when she saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road. Laura instinctively eased off the gas and narrowed her eyes. It was a doga young German Shepherd puppy, no more than 5 or 6 months old, with oversized paws and a thick winter coat that glistened in the early light. Its fur was the classic black and tan, ears tall and alert, and its stance, while small, was defiant. The puppy didn't flinch as her headlights beamed across the icy path. It stood there, dead center, eyes locked onto hers with an expression that wasn't fear, it was urgency. Laura tapped the horn lightly. Nothing. She flashed her brights. Still, the puppy remained rooted in place, as if the road didn't exist, only she, and the message it carried. She let out a slow breath. "What in the world?" Rolling down her window, Laura leaned out and called, "Hey, Shoo!" The pup tilted its head slightly, as if considering her command, then took a single step forward toward her. Laura frowned. Something wasn't right. There was no collar, no visible signs of injury, and despite the deep snow and bitter cold, the dog looked healthy. A stray pup? Or had someone abandoned it nearby? The logical part of her said to call animal control, wait in the cruiser, file the report, and move on. But then the dog did something strange. It turned around, took a few bounding steps toward the tree line, then stopped and looked back. Their eyes met again. Laura's heart gave a faint lurch. "Oh no, you've got something to show me, don't you?" It wasn't the first time she'd seen animals act with eerie intelligence. This was Colorado. After all, but this moment felt different. She opened the car door slowly, letting the cold slap her face, and stepped out into the snow. The puppy immediately wagged its tail once, then trotted forward, weaving through the road's slushy edge before disappearing behind a drift. Laura hesitated, then followed, boots crunching as she left behind the safety of her cruiser. As she reached the spot where the dog had paused, she noticed tiny paw prints veering into the woods. The trail was fresh. Laura glanced down the winding slope that led into a dense cluster of snow-draped pines. She took one more step, and as if on cue, the pup's head popped up from a bush, ahead, eyes bright, ears alert, tail wagging once more before it turned and continued into the trees. Laura exhaled, shaking her head. "What the hell am I doing?" She didn't know yet that each step she took was moving her closer to something more than a rescue. It was the beginning of a journey for herself, for a child, and for a nameless little shepherd who had chosen her, without hesitation, to follow. The forest was hushed beneath a thick blanket of snow, the kind that softened every footstep and wrapped the world in a muffled stillness. Officer Laura Whitman followed the young German Shepherd pup down a narrow trail that twisted deeper into the trees. Though the sun had now risen above the ridge, it offered little warmth. Ice clung to branches like glass, and the air smelled of pine, frost, and something distant wood smoke maybe, or memory. The pup, whom Laura had started calling Scout in her mind, darted confidently ahead, his tail high, ears perked, his paws leaving clear prints on the white path. Despite his youth, he couldn't have been more than 6 months old. Scout moved with remarkable certainty. Every few steps he would stop, glance over his shoulder, and wait just long enough to ensure Laura was still behind him. There was no fear in his eyes, only purpose. Laura, for her part, was beginning to regret not grabbing her winter boots. The standard-issue patrol shoes weren't built for off-road trekking through snow-covered forest. Her breath came in short clouds as she trudged forward, one hand instinctively resting on the grip of her sidearm, not because she expected trouble, but because it had become second nature. After all, she was chasing a lead given to her by a puppy. Logic and reason had long since fallen behind her in the snow. "Where are you taking me, little guy?" she muttered, half to herself. Scout gave a quick bark, not aggressive, more like encouragement, and pressed on. The trail curved sharply along a narrow ridge that overlooked a shallow frozen creek. A misstep could send someone tumbling down the embankment. Laura slowed, placing each step carefully. Her foot landed on a patch of ice hidden beneath a scatter of pine needles, and her boot shot out from under her. With a sharp gasp, she slipped. Before she could hit the ground, something nudged. Her thigh. Scout had rushed back and pressed his small body into hers, breaking the fall. Laura landed hard on one knee, but stayed upright. Wincing, she let out a breath. You're something else," she whispered, brushing snow off her gloves. Scout barked again, this time softer, almost like a whisper, and nudged her leg with his snout. Then, without waiting, he turned and trotted ahead once more. The landscape shifted as they pressed deeper. Trees grew thicker, light more sparse. After nearly 40 minutes of walking, Laura began to see signs of human presence. An old trail marker, worn and almost hidden beneath frost. A boot print, half filled with snow. Then came a shape square, and slumped emerging in the clearing ahead. A cabin. Small. Weather-beaten. Wood siding warped from years of wind and rain. Snow had piled along the roof and sides, nearly hiding it from view. A faded curtain fluttered behind one of the windows, ripped, stained. Laura approached slowly, instincts kicking in. Her breath caught as she neared the porch, which sagged under the weight of the snow. The door was slightly ajar. From inside came a faint sound. It wasn't a voice. Not exactly. More like a whimper. A cry too quiet to be casual, but too weak to be recent. Laura reached down and unbuttoned the clasp on her holster, not drawing the weapon, but readying it. She gestured for Scout to stay back, but the pup refused, sticking close by her side. She pushed open the door with her boot. The smell hit her first: cold rot, mildew, something else beneath it. The interior was dim, a small room with a broken stove, a tattered armchair, and a mattress shoved against one wall. A few cans scattered across the floor. And then, tucked into a corner, under a pile of blankets, something moved. Laura stepped closer, her eyes adjusting. A boyno, older than 9, thin, with tangled hair and pale skin lay curled beneath the covers. His eyes were half-lidded, lips dry and cracked. He clutched a bundle to his chest. Laura's stomach twisted when she realized what it was. A woman, unmoving, skin waxen, lips tinged blue, her arm draped protectively around the boy. Laura's voice came out in a whisper. "Oh my God!" The boy didn't react. He simply held on. Scout whimpered, stepping forward. The boy stirred faintly at the sound, his eyes fluttering. Laura knelt beside them, removing her glove and checking the woman's pulse. Nothing. She turned to the boy, brushing hair from his face. "Hey kid, can you hear me?" No response. Just a shallow breath. She fumbled for her radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Whitman. I've located a minor, approximately 9 years old, in severe hypothermic condition. One deceased adult female." requesting EMS to Hollow Creek Trail, approximately 1.5 miles in. I'll remain on site until arrival. As she spoke, Scout circled and lay beside the boy, pressing his small body against him for warmth. The child, even in semi-consciousness, reached weakly toward the pup. Laura blinked hard, fighting the well of emotion behind her eyes. She placed her hand over the boy's and whispered, "You're safe now. We're here." She didn't know yet who the boy was, or what had brought him to this place. But she knew this. Without the stubborn little German shepherd who blocked her road and refused to move, he wouldn't have made it another hour. The quiet inside the cabin was deeper than the snow-covered forest outside. Laura crouched beside the boy, her gloved fingers trembling slightly as she reached to check his pulse. It was faint, but there. His skin was cold to the touch, lips pale and dry, and his small hand chapped and red clung to the lifeless woman beside him. The woman was in her mid-30s, with dark blonde hair pulled into a loose braid. Her face was hollow, cheekbones sharp from hunger and exhaustion. Her body was curled protectively around the boy, as if shielding him from the cold even in her final moments. Laura gently shifted the blanket back and found a cracked wallet nearby. Inside was a worn photo of the woman smiling beside a younger version of the boy, both standing in front of a trailer with a faded blue stripe. Bethany Taylor. That was the name on the driver's license. Age 36. Address listed in Grand Junction, over 3 hours away by highway. The photo told Laura more than words could. This woman had once been whole, full of life, and whatever had brought her to this frozen cabin was a story written in hardship and silence. Laura turned to the boy again. His name wasn't in the wallet, but the photo had it handwritten in block letters on the back. Evan, age 6. The boy now looked closer to 9, so the picture must have been taken years ago. He hadn't spoken, hadn't even cried, just held on. Scout, the little German shepherd pup, had curled himself tightly at Evan's side, his warm body pressed against the boy's thin frame. Every so often, the puppy would lick Evan's cheek softly, as if reminding him that he was still here, still watching over him. Laura activated her radio again, speaking more quietly now. "Dispatch, EMS still en route? The boy's fading fast, he needs medical attention yesterday." "Copy that," came the reply. "Etta, 15 minutes. Paramedics are snow chaining their rig now." She pulled off one of her gloves and cupped Evan's cheek. "Evan, I'm Officer Whitman. You're safe now, sweetheart. Help is on the way." His eyes fluttered for the briefest moment. No words, but his fingers moved just barely to grip a fold of the puppy's fur. Scout didn't flinch. Laura scanned the room. There was no electricity, no heat. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, long cold. The shelves held only 3 dented cans: beans, peaches, and soup, all opened. Empty wrappers were balled in the trash, and a plastic bag held what looked like snow-packed clothes, likely their attempt to keep them dry. It was clear now. They'd come here seeking shelter, maybe thinking the cabin would save them. But the storm had lasted longer than their supplies, and help never came. Scout stood suddenly and walked to the door. He sniffed once, barked sharply, then looked at Laura. Flashing lights flickered through the trees finally. Laura stepped outside to flag the paramedics, snow crunching under her boots. The lead EMT was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a weathered face and calm eyes. His name tag read, Garrett Tom Garrett, a seasoned EMT who had worked wilderness rescues for over 20 years. "What do we have?" he asked as he hoisted a bag from the snow. "Boy, maybe 9 years old. Hypothermia, dehydration, but pulse is there. He hasn't spoken. The woman with him, she didn't make it." Tom nodded grimly. "Let's get him on warm 4 fluids and transport. Kid's lucky. Could have been a day too late." As they moved inside and gently lifted Evan onto the stretcher, Scout began to whine. He tried to hop up beside the boy, but Tom paused. "Is that dog his?" Laura answered without thinking. "He is now." Tom gave a short smile and stepped aside. "Then he rides with us." The paramedics worked quickly, wrapping Evan in warming blankets and checking his vitals. Scout never left his side. Even inside the ambulance, the pup lay curled beside the boy's legs, eyes alert, tail still. as if understanding the weight of the moment. Laura stood just outside the open doors, arms folded against the cold, watching the scene in silence. The image would stay with her boy and dog, both too young to understand how close they had come to the end, yet both still breathing, still here. She glanced once more at the cabin, then back at Scout. "You saved him," she whispered. "You saved them both." She didn't know yet how deep that bond would grow her, how much it would change Herbert in that moment. The decision was already made. She would stay involved. She wouldn't turn away. And the pup? He had already chosen his people. The hospital in Silver Pine Valley was a modest, two-story brick building nestled at the edge of town, just beneath the foothills of the Rockies. Snow still drifted lazily outside the frosted windows, though inside the emergency wing the air was warm and sterile, filled with the quiet shuffle of nurses' shoes and the beeping of monitors. Laura sat in a plastic chair outside room 214, her patrol jacket slung over one shoulder, her face drawn from hours without sleep. Scout lay curled at her feet, his head resting between his paws. Though just a pup, he'd remained alert during the ambulance ride, never once looking away from the stretcher where the boy Evan had lain unconscious, wrapped in thermal blankets. Now, after hours of waiting, Scout seemed to understand this place was safe, at least for now. A nurse approached, her scrubs patterned with cartoon bears. She was short and plump, with gray-streaked hair pulled back under a surgical cap. Her name badge read, Nancy Mullins. "He's awake," she said gently. "Weak, but stable. He's been asking about the dog." Laura stood slowly. "Can I?" Nancy nodded. "Go ahead. We haven't been able to get him to say much, but he keeps whispering about the puppy." Inside the room, the light was dimmed. Evan lay against a raised pillow, an oxygen cannula tucked beneath his nose. His skin was still pale, but the red flush of life had returned to his cheeks. His brown hair was damp from a sponge bath, and the IV in his arm glowed faintly under the monitors. He turned his head as Laura stepped in. Scout padded softly behind her, tail low, ears perked. "Hey there," Laura said, voice gentle. "You gave us a scare." Evan didn't answer. He blinked slowly, his gaze fixed on Scout. The puppy let out a soft whimper and walked to the edge of the bed. Evan's lips trembled. His fingers, though frail, reached toward the dog's head. Laura watched, unmoving, as Scout placed his chin carefully on the blanket, right beside Evan's hand. The boy's fingers threaded into the pup's fur. Then, in a whisper so thin it could have been wind, Evan said, "Please don't take him." It was the first sentence he'd spoken since they found him. Laura crouched down to eye level, heart caught in her throat. "He's yours," she said softly. "No one's taking him away." The tears came silently, tracking down the boy's cheeks. His chest rose in a shudder as he pressed his face against Scout's head. The dog didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, as still and present as any guardian could be. Later, in the family consultation room, Laura sat with the hospital's social worker, Angela Reeves, a woman in her early 50s with short, tightly curled brown hair and tired, intelligent eyes behind square-rimmed glasses. She was calm, professional, and wore a well-worn blue cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender. "I've done some digging," Angela said, flipping through a folder. Bethany Taylor had no next of kin listed. Her last employment was over a year ago at a diner in Mesa County. She was evicted 3 months ago. Since then, it's been shelters, and then nothing. They must have gone off-grid. Laura nodded slowly. "And Evan?" "Technically, he's a ward of the state now, but given the circumstances, Child Protective Services will prioritize temporary placement." "With strangers," Laura said, her voice tightening. Angela studied her. "Unless there's someone willing to foster him, someone stable, with a clean record, law enforcement background might actually help the application." Laura didn't respond at first. Her thoughts spiraled back to the cabin, the way the boy had held onto his mother's lifeless body, how he clung to that little dog like it was the last anchor he had. "I'll take him," Laura said finally. "At least while you figure things out. He doesn't need a stranger right now." Angela tilted her head. "You sure?" Laura glanced toward the room, where Scout was curled next to the hospital bed. "Yeah, I'm sure." That night, as the storm outside thickened and the hospital quieted, Laura sat beside Evan's bed, a paperback in her lap, unread. Evan slept, one hand still resting on Scout's back. The puppy snored gently, chest rising and falling in rhythm with the boys. For the first time in years, Laura didn't feel like she was waiting for something bad to happen. She wasn't grieving or bracing. She was simply present. And when Evan stirred in his sleep and whispered, "Scout," she knew the pup finally had a name. The snow had finally stopped falling, leaving the small town of Silver Pine Valley wrapped in a hushed stillness. The days had grown slightly longer, but the cold clung to the streets, rooftops, and bare-limbed trees. In room 214 of the hospital, the warmth was no longer just from the heater, but from the quiet rhythm of healing. It had been 5 days since Laura brought Evan in. 5 days of visits that began with silence and ended with small miracles. She had taken leave from the department, not because anyone told her to, but because it felt like the only thing that made sense. Every morning she arrived just after sunrise, a to-go coffee in one hand and Scout's leash in the other. Scout had become a fixture at the hospital, his small presence calming patients and staff alike. Nurses waved when they saw his fluffy ears perk up, and children in the pediatric wing begged to pet him. But Scout never stayed long with anyone else. His loyalty remained fixed on the boy in room 214. Evan, at first, had only whispered, a word here, a nod there. But Laura noticed the change, how his eyes followed her when she entered the room, how his hand now reached for Scout before he opened his mouth. On the 6th morning, as Laura settled into the vinyl chair beside his bed, Evan looked at her and said, "Do you have a kid?" Laura froze, the question catching her off guard. "No," she said softly, folding her hands in her lap. "I used to. His name was Tyler. He was a little older than you." Evan nodded slowly. "Is he gone?" "Yes," Laura replied. "A few years ago. Car accident." The room was quiet. Scout lay on the bed, his chin resting on Evan's thigh. After a long pause, Evan asked, "Did it hurt?" Laura blinked, unsure how to answer. "Not for him, and I hope not for your mom either." That was the first day Evan smiled. Later that week, Dr. Felix Manruth, attending pediatrician, a tall black man in his late 40s with warm eyes and a steady voice, told Laura Evan was well enough to be discharged. "He'll need continued counseling and nutritional care," the doctor explained. "But physically, he's stable. What he needs now is routine, familiarity, trust." Laura signed the temporary foster papers that evening under the supervision of Angela Reeves. She took the responsibility without hesitation. The paperwork was thick, the legal terms dense, but when Angela asked, "Are you sure?" Laura only said, "He doesn't have anyone else. And I think, maybe I don't either." They brought Evan home on a Thursday, just before dusk. Her house was a modest one-story with wooden floors, a small fireplace, and a blue porch swing that creaked in the wind. Laura had cleared out the spare bedroom and bought a second-hand twin bed, a desk, and a box of crayons with a sketch pad. A stuffed bear waited on the pillow. That night, she cooked grilled cheese sandwiches. Evan ate slowly, like someone still unsure if the food would last. Scout sat between them at the table, tail thumping the floor. After dinner, they sat on the couch by the fire. Laura wrapped a blanket around Evan's shoulders while Scout curled against his side. The fire crackled. The wind sighed outside. Evan leaned into her, slowly, hesitantly. Laura didn't move. Then, in a small, tired voice, he whispered, "You smell like my mom did when she was warm." Laura turned her head slightly, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. "Is that okay?" He nodded. She put her arm around him lightly at first. Then, as his small form leaned further in, she pulled him gently against her chest. It wasn't planned. It wasn't official. But that moment, that quiet, snow-framed embrace, was the beginning of something neither of them could name. A new rhythm, perhaps. Or the tentative start of a family made from loss, rescue, and a pup with more heart than size. Scout sighed happily, tail flicking once as he nestled between them. Outside, the snow began to fall again, this time gently, as if the world itself had softened. The snow had returned to Silver Pine Valley, blanketing the rooftops and sidewalks with a familiar hush. A full year had passed since Laura first saw the little German Shepherd puppy standing in the middle of Hollow Creek Road. Scout was no longer little. He had grown into a strong, graceful dog with deep golden brown eyes, a sleek black saddle, and a tail that never stopped wagging when Evan was near. But despite his size, there was still a puppy's spark in his gazier, protective, loyal. Laura stood on the front porch of their modest home, a steaming mug of cocoa in her gloved hands. The old wind chimes above the door tinkled softly in the breeze. Inside, a wreath of pine cones and red ribbon hung crookedly on the mantel, and the scent of cinnamon from yesterday's baking still lingered in the air. A snowman Evan had built lopsided, and missing one eye leaned dangerously near the driveway. This house had changed in a year. It was no longer just walls and wood. It held laughter, scraped knees, art projects, and Scout's chew toys hidden in every corner. And today it was filled with guests and townspeople gathering for the Winter Jubilee, a small-town tradition with hot cider, sleigh rides, and a lantern ceremony at dusk. Laura adjusted the scarf around her neck and scanned the town square, already bustling with children in knit hats and vendors selling homemade jam. She spotted Evan near the cider booth, his cheeks rosy, his brown hair peeking out beneath a bright blue beanie. He was laughing openly, freely, something Laura hadn't seen in those early days. Scout was at his side, walking proudly, his head held high, and his tail sweeping behind him like a banner. The stage at the center of the square had been decorated with pine boughs and white lights. Atop it stood Mayor Hank Russell, a barrel-chested man with thick white eyebrows and a booming voice. He was in his 60s, wore a red flannel shirt under a wool coat, and was known for shaking every hand and remembering every name. As the crowd gathered, Hank raised the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we light our lanterns tonight, I want to take a moment to honor a very special member of our community. Not one who pays taxes or votes, but one who stood firm, quite literally, in the path of help." The crowd chuckled, glancing around. A year ago, a young German Shepherd pup, now known to all of us as Scootry, refused to let Officer Laura Whitman pass on her patrol. Instead, he led her into the forest, to a cabin, to a boy in need, and he changed all of our lives. There were gasps of recognition and applause. Hank continued, "Today, we honor Scout, not just for what he did, but for what he reminds us that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest messages, and sometimes angels have paws." The crowd clapped, and children whistled. Scout tilted his head as if unsure what all the noise was about. Evan grinned and leaned down to hug him. Laura joined them on stage, her hand resting gently on Evan's shoulder. Hank handed her a small bronze plaque, engraved with Scout's name and the town's gratitude. She turned to the audience and, for a rare moment, let her walls down. "When I met Scout, I didn't know I needed saving too," she said. "I thought I was just doing my job, but that day, that pup didn't just rescue Evan, he rescued me." After the applause faded, the lanterns were lit, hundreds of soft golden lights floating into the twilight sky. Evan and Scout sat side by side on the grass, watching the orbs drift upward. Laura sat behind them, knees drawn up, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. Evan turned, eyes glowing. "Do you think my mom sent him, Scout?" Laura looked at the dog, now resting his head in Evan's lap. She smiled, not with sadness, but with something deeper. "I think she knew someone would need to find you, and I think Scout knew exactly where to go." Evan nodded. "I think he found you too." Laura ruffled his hair gently. "Maybe he found both of us." The three of them sat there as the sky turned lavender, surrounded by the glow of community, memory, and a future. Built not by blood, but by choice and a dog who refused to let them walk alone. Sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come from those who cannot speak, only act. Scout didn't bark orders or wear a badge. He simply stood his ground, followed his heart, and refused to give up on someone who needed saving. In doing so, he connected three broken souls, creating something stronger than any bloodline: a chosen family. If you believe in second chances, in the power of loyalty, and in the quiet strength of animals who change our lives, share this story. Comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. And if you haven't already, like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories that prove hope often arrives on 4 Paws.